Again, my name is John Pfeffer. I work with the Institute for Policy Studies. We have a project called the Global Just Transition Project. I'll put all that information in the chat in a little while. And as part of the Global Just Transition Project, we have a group, the Rare Earth Element Group, that focuses on rare earth elements. And in that context, we are delighted to invite Sophia Kalantzakis to talk to us today. The specific topic is U.S.-China competition over rare earths, but Sophia tells me she's gonna kind of look more broadly at the stakes, given the urgency of the situation and a lot of breaking news. Obviously, this week a new administration here in the United States has taken over with a different outlook on a lot of things, including minerals and energy policy more generally. Um, I want to introduce Sophia to you. I'll put a little bit of her bio in the chat as well. But she's the Global Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Public Policy at New York University in Abu Dhabi. NYU has a campus in Abu Dhabi. And she, in 2020, launched a new project called The Geopolitics and Ecology of Himalayan Water, which looks at water insecurity for 2.5 billion people. And she is, of course, the author of China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earths, which is a kind of text for this topic that we're talking about today, as well as the EU, US, and China tackling climate change policies and alliances for the Anthropocene, always a challenging word to pronounce. Sophia is going to talk for 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And you have a Q&A function, so please put your Qs in the Q&A. And if you have, of course, introductions or comments to make in the chat, that's also available for everyone. Thank you, Sophia, so much for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and greetings to everyone from Abu Dhabi, where the weather is not minus 15 degrees, but rather a comfortable 20. Um, I just like to start by saying that when we first arranged for me to do this talk, I thought its timing would be fortuitous. The election would be over, and we would know which way the pendulum had swung. And now it's already January 22nd of 2025, and with the new Trump administration coming into power, a lot has already happened. Now, I, like others, was sure, for instance, that the US would pull out of the Paris Agreement, that in terms of energy, the administration would now prioritize fossil fuels and deprioritize the green transition. I was expecting that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, would abandon what Frank Fanon calls climate as its organizational principle and replace it with an energy emergency principle that has already become the dominant narrative for the Trump administration. Now, perhaps in an effort to be objective and scholarly, you would expect me to center my remarks today on theories and maybe present you an overview of policies that concern rare earths primarily and critical minerals more generally. But I won't do that. For those of you who joined the previous webinar with Julie Klinger, she did a great job in her recent talk on this front. I'm going to share some other thoughts with you because politics matter, and I can already see the frame of what lies ahead. So please bear with me today as I gather my thoughts to share with you what I see as a new pattern, a new narrative that is sometimes obstructed by the noise of bold statements, especially by a political figure like Donald Trump. Here are some key points. The Paris Agreement of 2015 is over, according to the new administration, not because the United States pulled out immediately after Trump's swearing in ceremony 2 days ago, but because of the story the US is spinning about the Accord's record. It doesn't matter if the US is in it or not, the spin doctors are saying. Paris has already failed. Emissions keep going up, and countries are not honoring their pledges. China, in particular, is singled out as the main culprit. So, the climate organizing principle of the green industrial transition is being challenged and deconstructed. Why do it? It's costly, they say, and nobody's keeping the schedule they had proposed. Now, why is that so important to our discussion? Because in Paris, the global community decided that they had finally found an economically viable industrial plan to boost growth, create jobs, and hopefully reduce emissions. This was the core of the Paris Agreement, an industrial response to reducing emissions through the electrification of transport and the deployment of renewables so that they eventually dominate the energy mix. Climate was the organizing principle, but the consensus, in hindsight, revolved around an agreement that post-COVID, that decarbonization and digitalization, I might add, of the global economy were the only economic games in town. That's what drove all the industrial countries to embrace the transition quickly and assuredly. Except there was a problem. China's competitors realized that Beijing was ahead of the game. It had spent decades developing EV technology as well as renewables, and importantly, used every tool in its economic basket to bolster the scaling up of these technologies so that when the green light was given, it would dominate the new economic sectors. Why did China do that? So far, it's been shown that a country cannot become a leading industrial power without an automotive sector. But China could not compete in traditional car manufacturing. The US, the EU, Japan, and Korea, they were too far ahead. Yet it wanted to add value to its economy. So early on, it made a bet on EVs, appreciating that the climate crisis would drive the transition. Let's also not forget that for China and other countries in the developing world, EVs are not only a climate solution, but a response to the choking levels of pollution, black carbon that is shortening people's lives in urban megacities. It is also accelerating the heating of the planet, making glaciers melt more quickly, jeopardizing, for instance, the lives and livelihoods of 2.5 billion people in Asia who rely on the Himalaya for their water supply all the way downstream. Now, China did not only invest in the tech, but also strategically sought to dominate the global supply chains needed for this transition from mine to market. Now, to be humorous about it, in the ancient times of 2018, I published a book with Oxford University Press entitled China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earths, where I basically asked the following question: how is it not an egregious policy failure that industrial powers have agreed to decarbonize the global economy, but had failed to appreciate that they lack the indispensable ingredients like rare earths to ensure their success in producing the applications for this economic transformation? But at the time, I got pushback because globalization as we knew it was still the main frame governing how global economies worked. The presumption was that the bottom line dictated terms of interdependence, and as long as one had unobstructed access to materials, the market would provide solutions. Even when the prices of rare earths shot up and China's competitors became rattled, realizing that the PRC held a near monopoly of the resources, as soon as prices corrected themselves, they forgot their fear and went back to business as usual. However, what China's competitors discovered shortly after my book was published was that geopolitics can and did in the end trump economics. Trump won, term one, started the trade wars in 2018, and a policy of tit for tat with China ensued. He securitized supply chains and boldly threw down the gauntlet at the Chinese, inviting them openly to share the stage as a superpower that was now the US's chief rival. It was one more step in the Made in America narrative frame of bipolar competition. Like the Cold War, I was talking to John about the Cold War just a few minutes ago, but also not like the Cold War, as China was vastly different from the Soviet Union. Biden came in to further fuel contention in the name of democracy versus autocracy, at least initially. Then his approach turned to an industrial competitive narrative framed around domestic environmental justice and the creation of a new economy to produce well paying union jobs in the United States. In the name of the climate crisis, these goals could now be prioritized. It was called the Green Deal. This strategy resulted in tariffs, export restrictions, and the IRA. But as time went on, the decarbonization was no longer enough. It was not the only great industrial plan to be pursued. Digitalization, leading and controlling the tech imperium through AI and 5G, became the bigger priority. That's how the CHIPS Act came into effect, as well as a series of other restrictions and pressures on allies to invest in foundries on US soil and stop exporting their most advanced chips to China. What Biden's administration discovered is that America had wasted precious decades remaining stuck in the past. China was flooding the market with EVs, and no matter how much the federal government invested in decoupling from the PRC, reshoring, friendshoring, and rushing to build alternative supply chains and agreements, their EV cars were still too expensive. They couldn't produce batteries fast enough, nor magnets that contain rare earths, which were still overwhelmingly produced by the Chinese. China had the final product and was putting it out there. So the Biden administration tried to team up with Europe, that had a similar issue, to slap tariffs onto China and stall what was a clear trajectory to controlling the EV market. But then there was AI and the dematerialization of the global economy. Initially, the thought was that this kind of transition would help reduce emissions and the excessive use of materials to produce more products. After all, materially intensive production results in multiple footprints on water, energy, on society, ecosystem degradation impacts, to name a few. But it turned out that China had been pumping money into this sector, and through the Digital Belt and Road Initiative had already been able to produce the digital infrastructure necessary to become a tech leader at more affordable prices than the US, drawing in the developing world into their digital sphere of influence. Politically speaking, the US framed this as a boost for autocratic systems of government, where digital walls were now rising, overwhelming openness, democracy, equity, and inclusion. They accused China of using technology for control and surveillance in ways that infringed on the rights of their and others' citizens. But what was really happening was that the US was in danger of losing its competitive edge to China. The US could not allow such a thing to happen. Digitalization and AI overall represented a more significant economic shift than the electrification of transport. Now, what does this have to do with anything, you might ask? It matters because it turns out that the digital transition has turned into a liability rather than a bonus for climate action. Why? Because it's now become clear that to make it happen, its energy needs are insatiable. How will the world that has already developed its industrial climate strategy around the electrification of transport and renewables on the basis of increased energy demands because of population numbers and the development of the global south come to terms with the fact that the second major industrial transformation, what's called the fourth industrial revolution, has energy needs that have been completely under budgeted because they had been wildly underestimated. This is why Trump now says, we have an energy emergency. What does he mean? The appearance of tech oligarchs in the front row of his inauguration signals that their main ask from the new administration is to undo the energy constraints of a clean transition. Tech has overtaken the priority of decarbonizing the global economy. That's why all forms of energy are again on the table. We just need so much more. That's why climate is no longer the organizational principle. That's why Trump's pundits call Paris a dead treaty, because they wanted to unravel and discredit it as the central preoccupation of the global commons. Moreover, talk about AI and the moral, legal, and technological discussions of its pros and cons further obscures the violent catastrophe that the climate crisis is wreaking on societies and ecosystems all around the globe. In fact, climate talk constitutes a liability for the tech industry if it wants to control the tech imperium. Worries of security, contention, competition have been used to quell any attempts at meaningful cooperation. These are some of my initial thoughts, perhaps provocative, but hopefully they give impetus to our discussion. And I would like to make some predictions to tie it all back to our original topic of rare earths. The US is hoping to make tech the major plan to ensure it dominates the world order and outcompetes China. In fact, earlier today, President Trump announced a $500 billion private AI plan to build new AI data centers in the US on federal land and his intention to cut regulation. He rescinded Biden's regulations of the industry, calling it red tape, as soon as he took office. By deprioritizing EVs and renewables, Washington perhaps hopes that China too will bifurcate its investments, lose steam in the process, and fall behind. But this is not the Reagan era, during which the US argued that by raising defense spending sky high, it brought down the Soviet Union. 30 years of insight now gives us a whole different take on how and why the Berlin Wall fell. China will not be falling. Its leaders study history and have been especially reflected on the reasons behind the fall of the Soviet Union. China is also the second largest economy in the world, and they're trading anywhere and everywhere. China has already mastered the scaled up production and affordability of the key technologies necessary for achieving the road to net zero. It has secured the supply chains for EV production, making its products affordable and thereby rapidly exportable worldwide. I was in Kathmandu in Nepal a few days ago, and while there was still air pollution, locals argued that air quality improved because the government now incentivizes the purchasing of EVs. The cars are mostly Chinese, but also Indian, and the buses are all from China. China will not back out of the decarbonization plan because it already has all the components to be successful and lead the world transition. It has the rare earths, it's importing increasing amounts of rare earths, it refines rare earths, it maintains the dominant position in magnet production that rely on rare earths, and it's still leading in battery production and know-how. Now, moving away from the electrification of transport, by saying the public has no buy-in will just leave the US behind in this market. The US will get stuck with an increasingly obsolete technology, and if ever it decides to shift, it will be far behind. Once again, the lessons of the rare earth crisis have not been heeded. I would also like to add that the reason that the public hasn't bought into the electrification of transport in the United States is because US EVs are still too expensive for the average person, while the Chinese cars are not. Now, I understand that President Trump plans to put tariffs on rare earth imports from China in the name of national security, but that too is a distraction and serves as a way to help companies like MP Materials, who mine rare earths domestically, as well as other junior miners who are making a case for facilitating and expediting new mining permits. and also getting subsidies. He will likely try to buy Greenland, another distraction, because Greenland has critical minerals and rare earths specifically. But more importantly, it's part of the Arctic Circle, and China has expressed near Arctic ambitions as the ice melts and sea lanes become available. He will try to control the Panama Canal in his pursuit of blocking China and booting it out of America's backyard. These things will happen, but we must remember it's not the defense industry that is driving the market for rare earths, but renewables and the electrification of transport, where the bulk of the material is needed. Now, at this juncture, I would like to respond to a somewhat misguided belief that Elon Musk's relation with Trump means that EVs and subsidies for EVs will be spared. Musk is no longer that interested in Tesla. Musk, the adventurous, innovator, and disruptor, has moved on in some sense. After all, Tesla accounted for 1.2 million car sales worldwide, while BMW alone sold close to 1.7 million. It's a drop in the bucket, and Tesla car sales will continue to enjoy the greatest market share of the US market, especially since its competition, like GM, has had to pull back on their EV commitments as their gas powered vehicle market share in China has collapsed. Musk is focused on SpaceX, where he can innovate on taxpayer money, building a new legacy that allows him to dream of and develop new and profitable future tech. Space tourism, space mining, planting a flag on Mars, and controlling satellites are all at the heart of this agenda. His goal is to pull out all the stops, pursue deregulation, and reduce oversight, and slowly break down government's role as a redistributor and regulator of economic activity. But China is not standing idly by, watching the tech giants rally behind Trump. China has made strides in AI, 5G, and the Internet of Things. It is also deeply involved in the space race and has been heavily investing in this sector. It has increased its defense budget and its Navy presence, where once the US alone dominated the seas. Moreover, however much the US pushes its allies, it will not be easy for them to forgo the Chinese market, especially if foes and allies alike are hit with Trump's tariffs. Countries do not want to live in a bipolar world. They prefer multipolarity and the options this affords them. The more the West tries to delay China's tech industries from getting ahead, the more they will accrue the tech they want elsewhere and or develop it locally. Rare earths in 2010 taught us a valuable lesson that was squandered. And while there are those who insist that China wasn't really using economic statecraft by temporarily halting exports of rare earths to Japan over a trawler incident, I argue that in 2010, the PRC's competitors were offered an important glimpse into the future. China was willing and able to use economic statecraft, and it had a clear industrial plan. Importantly, it seems that the response to climate change has over time become reduced to a full-fledged battle over resources. Rare earths, critical minerals, water, supply chains, and food have become securitized, and the geopolitics of contention make the case for blocking and sabotaging the competition to secure what countries need for their fourth industrial revolution plans that are now at play, independent of the climate emergency. Some closing remarks. The US has for quite some time been struggling to find its footing in the new power configuration. China has not only arrived economically and militarily, it has developed instruments of influence, new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRI, that is no longer just an infrastructure project of connectivity, but covers environment, culture, education, media, digital connectivity, security, health, tourism, but it also offers a global vision, that of ecological civilization, a developmentalist narrative of growth within the boundaries of sustainability. But it's not only that China has arrived, it is also that other countries have risen, and have become regional powers, like the Gulf states. States like India and Turkey are populous, outward looking, and seek to exert their influence. The BRICS configuration now represents 35% of global GDP and 45% of the population, versus the G7 that represents 30% of GDP and 10% of the population. In Trump's second term, the president has made it clear that he will adopt a transactional approach toward U.S. allies and competitors alike in defense of his America First framework. Trump's second term will most likely escalate competition and contention further, and for a time the world will seem to be in chaos, certainly in distraction. But I believe that things will not go as the administration plans. Countries have had a first brush with Trumpism, and they are now better prepared to deal with the fallout. They will give it some time, but they are already realigning. Modi's India is actively looking to repair its relations with China. The EU is also considering its options, trade deals with Latin America, rapprochement with China, as relations with the US are expected to become quite stormy. It remains to be seen how things will turn out, but it's important not to lose sight of what is actually happening in order to respond to and understand what is actually at stake. My hope is that as the climate crisis worsens, the EU and China can keep COP negotiations alive and produce agreements and action moving forward despite US obstructionism. After all, reaching Mars might be Musk's fantasy, but the lives and livelihoods for billions of people will be affected by what we do and do not do here on Earth. A couple of months ago, I had the pleasure of attending a talk by Sultan Al Nayati, who was the first astronaut from the UAE to serve on the International Space Station for a 6-month mission as part of Expedition 69. He was also the first Arab astronaut to perform a spacewalk. Sultan Al Nayati was asked a lot of questions. How did he prep? What was it like? You can imagine. But two things stood out to me. First, like others who had seen our planet from that far away, Al Nayati was moved by its beauty and fragility. He called it our mothership and reminded students how important it was to protect it. Now, that probably doesn't surprise you. It's been said before. But then, in discussing space exploration, he said that following the early years of competition, space had now become an area of global collaboration. He found that inspiring, and it showed how humanity could unite for a common goal. It seems that here on Earth, the message of collaboration has completely missed the mark. It is this that we need to remember and find ways to go back to the drawing board so that our actions do not bring us to the point of no return that is quickly approaching. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Sophia. You've raised a lot of really provocative questions with your opening remarks, and I encourage people who are provoked to ask questions in the Q&A. There's a comment about surveillance in the chat, and we might turn to that Chinese surveillance. But I want to ask you first about this notion that the climate as an organizing principle has largely been eclipsed, if you will. Paris Agreement not really working, emissions continuing to grow, this paradigm being overtaken in some sense by the fourth industrial revolution, the dematerialization, emphasis on AI, but with that caveat that it requires an enormous amount of energy to run this. Um, it's of course difficult for me and perhaps for others to think of Donald Trump as anything but a backward-looking president, someone who wants to drag the United States back to the 1950s, the 1850s, perhaps the 1750s. So the idea that Trump perhaps is ahead of the curve on this in kind of rejecting the climate paradigm and embracing the tech visions of his principal advisors, for instance, is of course deeply troubling. So I want to ask you, well, That's the case here in the United States. You've talked a little bit about China, how China is still kind of holding to a certain extent to a climate as an organizing principle with BRI and other of its programs, even as it develops its high tech in the fourth industrial revolution. But stepping outside of the United States and China for a moment, what about other parts of the world? Do you think that this kind of eclipsing of climate as an organizing principle is in some sense geopolitically inevitable? I mean, it seems like Europe, for instance, still holds pretty strongly to the climate paradigm, and this is certainly the Green Deal of the EU still represents a major kind of focal point of its policy, of its industrial policy. And then there are all the countries that, well, frankly, don't have the resources to participate, at least yet, in a fourth industrial revolution. Um, how are they kind of figuring out their place in this order? And what impact do you think this has? There's a lot of questions for it. What impact does this have on questions of climate justice? In other words, the demands that have been put forward, for instance, in the COP most recently in Azerbaijan, but will be put forward again in Brazil, the demands of richer countries to provide the financing for the global south or poorer countries to do the energy transition. If climate is no longer kind of the organizing principle, what does that mean for climate justice questions?
Wow, that those are a lot of questions. So I want to start by saying that when I spoke of the climate organizing principle, I'm a big stickler for the vocabulary that administrations use and then pundits repeat. So this idea of Biden's notion of creating, the Green Deal was his industrial response. He created an industrial response um, that he centered around the concept of climate. We know that Trump is a climate denier, first of all. And I think that it's very interesting because I'm hearing people from the administration and people who've worked with Trump before and who work in the energy sphere um, talk and hearing Trump talk about an energy emergency. It really got me thinking as to what does he mean by that? And I think we have all are we're all slowly realizing that the digitalization of the world and AI in particular, um, but this push for the digitalization and dematerialization of the economy is going to be so energy intensive. And in order, and there's a problem because when we first found a solution, an industrial solution to reduce emissions, we were relying on the electrification of transport and the inclusion of renewables in the energy mix. But now we realize that we had budgeted for, let's say, 1 unit of energy, and now we're going to need 10. So, America, the United States had never abandoned its particular strong position as the number one fossil fuel producer in the world. I mean, we forget that the United States went from being like super energy dependent in a way on the Middle East and other countries for imports to being the number one producer of oil and gas globally. And it's been making use of this particular weapon, or rather, advantage. Weapon is not the right word. Um, the so in the those in the tech industry have to figure out how are they going to power this giant fourth industrial revolution that they are creating, and it cannot happen if we stick to all the climate goals because we need so much energy to power these data centers that no one has come to terms with the amounts of energy needed. So this is why I said that I think and I think whatever we might think of Trump, I think having been a big follower and participant in all kinds of political situations, I want to just say that he has some kind of raw instinct for things. And yes, people are advising him. Yes, people influence him. Yes, he says all sorts of different things, but he is a change maker in many ways that incremental policy um, changes that were made by previous regimes to create a stability um, could not do. So I think it's been summarized, the whole thing has been summarized in this concept of energy emergency because we need to beat everybody in through the fourth industrial revolution, and therefore we need everything so that we can create all of this in America. Now, the rest of the world. I definitely think that this is the American narrative. The problem with the United States is that, think about it. It is the loudest. It is the most influential in terms of media, in terms of like communication. It can overpower what is truly happening in the other parts of the world. So this is why I've enjoyed being in Abu Dhabi so much, because from this vantage point, I know that this is being crafted, this message, this framework is being crafted in America. That's why I call it a sort of a made in America story, by which they're projecting as if it's happening in the rest of the world, but that's not quite true. As you said, the European Union is uh, sticking to the Green Deal, of course, because they too face elections and there are more populist governments coming to power. This is going to be rebranded, how would I say, rebranded, reframed as energy security, diversification, protection from, the impact of Russia's aggression on Ukraine. All sorts of different reasons are going to come into play for Europe to maintain these kinds of investments that it's made. I also think that it will continue, although Europe too is far behind, it will pursue the electrification of transport because if not, the automotive industry that also really sells in the Chinese market will lose its market share. In fact, there are big bets being placed by certain German companies as to, what part of their business they're prioritizing. Because frankly, this is why GM is also failing in China now. The push is for the electrification of transport. So people have no incentive to buy the old technology. Um, in terms of uh, smaller countries or other countries, everyone is talking AI. It doesn't matter the size of the country. People want to invest in the knowledge economy. They're banding together. Greece is talking about AI day and night. Greece is part of the EU, though. So there's the strength in the being a partner, a member state of the European Union. However, you wouldn't think of Greece as the place that's going to be leading the AI revolution, although it has very good engineers and computer scientists and has been attracting a lot of investment also by tech companies for different reasons. But places like India is producing electric vehicles. India has a very strong tech industry. So they too are, they have to cope with this tug of war. I also mentioned that the electrification of transport will continue in the rest of the world because in a lot of the developing countries, the problem is pollution. The air is unbreathable. It is something that we've almost forgotten in the United States, although we have bad days. But you go to China, you go to India, you go to New Delhi, you go to Kathmandu, these places have very, very high levels of pollution. And as I told you, I was in Kathmandu a few days ago, and I saw it from last year to this year that the air seemed less polluted. Now, it could be the weather, the winds, not blowing some of the pollution from India into the valley. But everyone who lives there is saying that because of this transition to the electrification of transport, they're seeing a considerable difference. So there are a lot of different reasons for which this transition is going to move forward. But I do believe that China will stay the course because it also has the advantage. It's a question of how the United States is going to try to discredit it. It will not really expend that much of its funds and energy on the decarbonization drive now. But, like Tesla already has the biggest market share. They will continue to enjoy this market share. If you are to buy an electric vehicle, you will probably buy a Tesla because Chinese cars are also being hit with very high tariffs. So we're going to see how it goes. But that's, I think, pretty much where we stand. All governments, small and large, want a piece of the pie, both for decarbonization and for digitalization.
Excellent. Thank you. Um, well, let me follow up on this last comment about getting a piece of the pie, because obviously countries are making calculations based on what they have, whatever deposits they may have, raw materials as well as processed materials and finished products. Um, Indonesia famously has been caught between China and the United States, or has leveraged its position between China and the United States in order to play one off the other. It obviously has a lot of nickel that it, as well as coal, so it's got its feet in both the old fossil fuel economy and the new critical energy transition mineral economy. But how are other countries kind of dealing with this competition between the United States and China? And what kind of strategies do you think they will adopt, particularly with respect to their minerals, their critical minerals, including rare earth elements, now that you have a Trump administration coming in with different priorities? And an evolving Chinese strategy. Is the Indonesian option of kind of resource nationalism? Is that something we will see increasingly across the world?
I think it depends on each country's leverage, on the government's ability to really use this advantage. I mean, there are a couple of things here. The first thing is that, and I think the Secretary General of the United Nations came out and said that this transition to clean um, energy and the electrification of transport in the name of climate should not become a starting pistol for this kind of resource competition and the rape and pillage, let's put it this way, of developing nations who are rich in minerals, but then never end up becoming participants and partners in the production of, uh, you know, final products or applications, right? They're being transformed into holes in the ground. So he formed a committee uh, of nations that were supposed to discuss how this kind of transition and how these mineral rich countries could come up with a solution and a policy and a strategy that will be equitable and inclusive. So the whole idea is not to sustain this kind of division between the global south and the global north. The usual suspects are producing the end products, are getting the market share, the bigger piece of the pie, and the countries that are developing are, barely able to. I mean, we keep telling them that they're going to leapfrog, but the reality is we then won't share either funding or the technology so that they too can, really have a seat at the table. So this is something that's being considered at many levels in various international organizations. In terms of renewables, the IRENA headquarters are housed here in Abu Dhabi. This is an intergovernmental agency, a newer one that doesn't carry the baggage of, for example, the International Energy Agency or other post World War II creations of the victorious West. It is an organization that focuses on the deployment of renewables, knowledge sharing, investments. So there are different ways by which the rest of the world is really approaching this. Now, I think, as I said before, the United States wants to create a situation where it's the US and China. Now, the rest of the world does not want that. They want options. They don't want to have to pick sides. I frankly asked my students, I said, well, okay, who do you prefer as a hegemon? Would you like the US or China? And they're like, we really don't want to choose. I said, well, what if you had to choose? So it was difficult. They're like, well, we don't know. The US meddles with everybody. China, we don't know enough about. They don't seem to be bothering anyone. People across the world are having different thoughts. The sure thing is that most countries around the world do not want to live in a bipolar situation. They saw this video, as I would say before, with the Cold War and the Soviet Union. This is not what they envision. They like to be able to negotiate. As you said, some are trying to up their game through resource nationalism. But in a world where they're stuck between the sides, their options become much more limited. This game is not going to happen. As much as the United States really wants to promote this, the only thing that this kind of frame and formulation has created is to really make China an indispensable partner and voice in every negotiation. It's like they invited China to be the superpower next to the United States. And now nobody can make a decision in the world without really consulting China. So it's one of those things where be careful what you wish for, because you've now, I mean, not that China hadn't risen, not that China was not a strong power, not that China is not building a military power, not that China is not becoming much more autocratic and centralized for different reasons. I believe, um, I mean, among other, apart from the fact that that's sort of the government system, I think that there is a growing anxiety that the climate crisis is going to create so much chaos in the world that for China, ensuring stability means having more control. They have 1.2 billion people. I mean, the United States is under 400 million, and we can't even like agree on anything. Imagine if you're 3 times the size with different nationalities, very different regions, even languages, religions. I mean, China is a complicated place and a big place. So is India. So there are a lot of reasons why countries are doing what they're doing. And, I think, I think we, I think the United States would benefit by having a less, how would I say it? I don't want to call it even provincial view of the globe, but at least there has to be some recognition that times have changed. And this is not the 1950s or 60s or 70s.
That's for sure. We have time, I think, for one more question. And let's bring it back to rare earth elements for a moment. You talked about how there was an illusion, perhaps, that access to rare earth elements would be guaranteed as a result of globalization, that markets would be kind of free, more or less. And even if China was kind of concentrating control over the sourcing of rare earth elements, both the production and the processing of rare earth elements, that the United States and other countries, if they needed them, get them, could buy them.
Of
Might
course.
price might go up, price might go down, but increasingly that is proven to be not necessarily correct, as restrictions are put on rare earth elements. Um, the United States has kind of recommitted to mining rare earth elements, opening up mine in California, and securing access, for instance, to Australian sources and other sources around the world. Um, eh, the breakdown of this kind of market or neoliberal or globalized understanding of supply chains and its replacement with a more geopolitical understanding of rare earths in this case, and the access to rare earths. Um, Obviously, for Trump, he's interested in, securitizing this and getting U.S. Sources and from friends. Uh, do you think over the next, looking beyond perhaps the Trump administration, is that what we're going to be seeing? Just this kind of race by countries to develop their own supplies, the supplies of their friends, and to just kind of transform what had been a neoliberal and market globalized understanding of supply chains to this completely kind of geopolitical understanding of supply chains?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started talking about this, I was saying, do not let this happen. Do not let this happen. This is like such a bad idea. Do not let this happen. We don't have enough time. Because look, I'm looking at it from the perspective of the climate emergency. If we didn't have the climate emergency, okay, things are like cyclical. Today, we have strong industrial policy because we're in competition. Maybe it wouldn't have been such a big deal. But but what we have is a huge threat to the entire stability of the world order and the planet and the people and the ecosystem. This is like unprecedented what's happening. I mean, anyone sitting in the United States today cannot be pretending that the climate crisis does not constitute a huge vulnerability for the United States when we've been watching what's happening in California. I mean, and when California ends for this cycle, there's going to be some flood or there's going to be some other catastrophic uh, phenomenon. Uh, New York has had a drought. They've been putting citizens on alert not to waste water. I mean, things are happening all around the world, and pretending that this is not the greatest threat to global stability is completely climate uninformed. I have no words to describe it. So let's put it this way. I think that geopolitical contention is going to uh, keep growing for the foreseeable future. I don't know how it's going to play out. Maybe the United States is overplaying its hand, but then the United States is also super strong, and who knows who's going to go down first. There's surprises in politics and in life, but this is a very pivotal moment. But again, for me, all of this is like noise. We're missing the great opportunity of really banding together to find ways to deal with the climate crisis, build resilience, reduce emissions, move to the road for net zero. But it's not only about cars and the reduction of emissions. It's about re-examining consumption, protecting ecosystems. China, for instance, has a whole plan to reshape its cities into sponge cities, cities that are able to absorb like the changes in the weather, floods, all of this. And you're sitting there going, "Wow, that's very forward thinking." But on the other hand, their concept of dealing with all of these challenges is because it's so centralized and how would I say, engineering oriented. It's like it's creating zones. Here we will live, here we will have industry, and here we will preserve ecosystems. That in itself is presented as a success story. Now, anybody who understands ecology understands that this kind of zoning of the planet is also going to prove to be a bad idea. So, what are we all doing? Technology is important. I mean, I was just recently in Korea in a conference about AI, and there are all these anxieties. Will AI be making decisions for nuclear weapons? Will, AI take jobs? Will AI, you know, uh, really undermine any kind of cybersecurity protocol that we have? What are the moral consequences of AI? And in the meantime, I understand that this is like the new flashy item on the agenda, but the reality is that the climate crisis is accelerating at unprecedented levels and rates. It's speeding up exponentially. And, we're talking about everything but the elephant in the room. So, from my perspective, all of this is like distraction and noise. And this is why I felt like I needed to reframe the United States narrative so that we can clearly see why it is that all of the energy is back on the table, right? Because America has this energy. These interests want to sell this energy. The data people want to buy this energy. Uh, there isn't enough of it. They're resurrecting nuclear, power stations. They want to deploy and build new nuclear power stations. We haven't even had a conversation about what we think about nuclear energy in the United States and elsewhere. And suddenly the mantra is, oh, we need to use nuclear energy without even having a real consultation. So these are the things I really hate to see us all kind of go down a path, tumbling down a path without any kinds of checks and balances in a moment to really consider what is being proposed and for what reasons we're doing things.
But that's a very, very helpful warning, especially around checks and balances when we are potentially seeing the dismantlement of those here in the United States politically, but also in kind of describing the factors, the driving forces behind some of the policies that we see. And I really thank you for kind of, well, pulling the curtain aside so we can see behind some of these policies, understanding why the United States under Trump is making these moves, why China is doing what it is doing. And I really thank you for this really very helpful exploration of not only the factors that we're dealing with, but as you said, the urgent crisis that we all face, namely the climate crisis. We will, oh, now we have some questions, but unfortunately, we're going to be wrapping up. Um, but they're more comments than questions. We will put this on YouTube so that it will be available to folks. And we look forward to following up with you, Sophia, especially as you continue your research on water resources and all the rest.
Thank you.